First of all, as someone who has been and is a huge supporter of USAID, this is an incredibly important nomination. I congratulate you on being nominated. And I appreciate having listened to you here at the hearing describe your priorities in the same way that you did in the private meeting that we had. And there are a lot of issues I have, some which I'll submit for the record, but the one that I want to pursue with you is the question of democracy, governance, and following on to Senator Cardin's questions on human rights. I'm concerned that democracy and governance at AID under the president's tenure has been cut by 38%. And I think there are a lot of critical countries in the Middle East, North Africa, Latin America, and Africa as a whole that have great needs that are woefully underfunded. And part of our challenge is, yes, economic growth and giving people greater opportunities, but in part that comes from more transparent democratic governance at the end of the day in countries, which is a longer-term proposition, but nonetheless incredibly important to stop, because when in the Middle East you are facing a future that is so dismal that you can have your mind converted to believe that dying is more glorifying than living, that's a real challenge. It's a challenge to our national security and interests. It's a challenge in the region. And unless we change the dynamics of what's happening in these countries over time, we will continuously be in a perpetual war. And so I think it's important to be thinking about that in the long term, but it's got to start in a more significant way. When you cut by 38% democracy and governance, it doesn't lead us in the right direction. So one is I'd like to get your sense of how you'll try to stem the tide here. Two, I'd like to get a sense from you that, and you and I talked about this a little bit, about those who would say that stability is more important than democracy and governance, that we're willing to look the other way on democracy and governance in order to have stability. And three, do you believe that if a country resists or attempts to thwart our democracy initiatives, that we should simply end those programs in that country? As we are seeing our challenges, for example, in Pakistan, which several members of this committee and others of the Senate have written about NGOs, NDI, and the Republican Institute, and Save the Children, and others having challenges in Pakistan. Give me a sense on those issues.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you both for the conversation we had the other day and your leadership on these issues. I agree with you on the importance of resources, and I believe you're aware that the President's request includes an increase in resources. But I think there's several other things we need to do. One is press others to also increase their resources. I think worldwide, if you look at investments in democracy, governance, and human rights, they're far below where they should be. And I think we're in agreement that this is essentially the backbone that is needed to ensure that the gains of development are sustained. I'd also like to look at the potential impact of having additional personnel on the ground, particularly democracy and governance officers, who often, with technical assistance, not no assistance, but not necessarily large quantities of assistance, can play a hugely important role in training and using their convening power and other tools to build capacity. I think AID's record on training at the institutional level for civil society and NGOs is something we can build out. I know the agency is looking at how to make greater use of regional platforms where more people and more organizations can be trained at once, and where also, and importantly, networks can be built. I also believe, sir, that a government that is credible in the eyes of its citizens is a government that delivers transparently and in ways that are meaningful and impact the lives of those citizens. So in the areas where AID has a very, very big presence and budget in health and in food security, the agency has worked on, and I think we can expand, also looking at governance in those sectors. Is it transparent? Are the budgets transparent? Are citizens able to avail themselves of the equivalent of a feedback loop to ensure that, again, those services are delivered, but in a way that is effective and transparent? I mentioned in response to Senator Cardin the Open Government Partnership. I have been quite impressed by what that has provided in terms of triggering a worldwide debate on what open governance means and what the obligations of governments are, while also exercising the muscles of some governments in transition with their civil societies to see what it's actually like to both cooperate and have civil society hold governments accountable. I believe as well aid is in a very good position, along with the State Department, often to play the role of broker or facilitator in dialogue between governments and civil society. I appreciate that you also made, sir, the point about this being a long-term proposition. I think the importance of our investing as a nation through USAID and by any other means in institution building is ultimately the key, because it's when we've got strong, effective, and transparent institutions that I think we've got the greatest assurance.
Let me make one observation before my time rubs out, and one final question.
Yeah.
And in your answer, which I appreciate, a lot of it was focused on governance, and I agree, that's an important issue. But I also think we have to decide whether AID is going to play a role in democracy building or not. And if it is, then it needs to be robust. And if it's not, then we need to think about how we move those resources to an entity that would. And which brings me to my final question. I'm pleased to see that the administration has its traditional request for Cuba democracy programs of $20 million. I have clearly a very different view of U.S.-Cuba policy than the administration. But the one thing I would think that we can all come together on is programs that ultimately we pursue worldwide in other countries that are undemocratic, and that we don't allow the entities in those countries, whether they are autocratic dictatorships or other authoritarian regimes, to just stop our programs at the end of the day because they don't like it. Otherwise, we would have given up a long time ago, and we wouldn't have been successful in, Eastern Europe at the time of Václav Havel, Lech Walesa, and so many others. So the question is, as it relates to Cuba democracy programs, can you make a commitment that you'll prioritize programs that strengthen independent civil society, defends human rights, expands democratic space, and increase access to information inside of Cuba?
Senator, yes, let me address a couple of things you've said. First, I believe that the Agency for International Development is and must be an agency that is about supporting democratic institutions, expanding democracy and democratic practices. So I think that is and must remain a priority. With respect to Cuba, my understanding is aid is continuing programs in democracy, governance, human rights, and the free flow of information, and intends to do so, and that is certainly my intention if confirmed. I also believe you make a very important point with respect to situations where we find that governments reject, close space, or take other measures that constrain the evolution of democracy. I think we need to respond in those cases. I think we may respond differently in different cases and must do what's effective. In some cases, we may not be supporting an actual government. We may be working primarily with local civil society or other groups. But I do think it's something we must respond to, and I will. Thank you.
Thank you.